Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I wanted to avoid a formal speech. I get bored by my own speeches giving them. So what I would like to do is just take about 10 minutes and think out loud a little bit with you this afternoon, and then Mark and I will have a few questions back and forth. And what I'd like to do is try to step back and get some perspective on what has been happening in this region since the 2011 Arab awakening. That Arab awakening dramatically brought to the surface really four struggles: moderate Muslims versus Islamist extremists, embodied most extremely in the form of al-Qaeda; secularists versus theocrats, those who believe in the separation of religion from the state, versus those that believe that the state should be an instrument of religion; Sunni versus Shia, with the subtext of Sunni states confronting Iran, Arab states confronting Iran; and finally Democrats versus authoritarians, and the authoritarians really of two varieties, religious and military. Now there are overlaps among these four struggles, yet they all have, I would argue, distinctive elements. And there is a limited ability by the United States and Israel to influence the outcome of these four struggles, but our ability to affect it is not non-existent. And our challenge is to try to influence the direction of these struggles so as to reduce violence, increase stability, and advance our values and interests. So how are we doing in meeting these four separate challenges? Well, we have to admit that we're in the early days of dealing with these changes. It's going to go on, the playing out of these struggles is going to go on for a long time, and there are going to be ups and downs, good days and bad days. But I think we can give an initial progress report, and I'd like to try to do that struggle by struggle. First, moderate Muslims versus Islamist extremists. How are we doing? Not well. And the reason, I think, is largely our ineffective response to the crisis in Syria. A number of us have been saying for over 2 years that the longer the struggle in Syria goes on, the longer Assad stays in power, the more violent it would become, the more sectarian it would become, the more it would destabilize Syria's neighbors, and the more it would open the door to al-Qaeda. And that, of course, sadly, is exactly what has happened. Two organizations, ISIL and al-Nusra, have large numbers in Syria and in Iraq. They are well supplied. The inflow of terrorists across the borders, as reported in the press, is much larger than what was occurring in Iraq in the dark days of 2005 and 2006. And what we are faced with is the prospect of an al-Qaeda safe haven in both Syria and Iraq. And this is a threat to the United States, it is a threat to Israel, and it is a threat whatever happens to Assad, whether he goes or stays. So what should be our strategy? Well, we've got to support the moderates, we've got to fight the extremists. It's not the kind of extremist threat you can handle by drone strikes. This is going to require fighters on the ground being willing to engage al-Qaeda. And that is why the United States has increased its military and intelligence support to Iraq, and why it belatedly, if press reports are to be believed, is increasing its support for the moderate Syrian opposition elements that are willing to fight al-Qaeda. We are late in reacting to this struggle. We are behind, and this is going to be a struggle of years, if not a decade. Second struggle, Secularists versus the theocrats. Again, how are we doing? Mixed results. Based on our values, we should tend to side with the secularists. But in this region, I think they are generally weak. They have been pressed by both kinds of authoritarians, both religious and military. Overt Western support is important, but it also runs the risk of discrediting these elements. And this is a part of the world, as you know better than I, where religion is very important to masses of people. And a secularism that is anti-religious or tries to exclude religious expression from public life simply won't succeed. So our strategy here needs to be to urge tolerance and political systems that permit expression of all views, all religious and non-religious views, and oppresses none of them. But again, this is a fight that is going to be played out in each of these countries, and it's going to be one on which I think we have only marginal influence. Third struggle, Sunni versus Shia. How are we doing? Another place where our influence is limited, where it's going badly. And once again, a lot of the blame is on what's happening in Syria and what we have permitted to happen in Syria. Syria is fanning sectarian tensions. It risks plunging the region into a Sunni versus Shia war, and indeed a proxy war between Saudi and the Sunni states on the one hand, and Iran and Hezbollah on the other. Such a war will, so far as I can see, be never-ending, and it is in no one's interests. It will also not be avoided by states seeking stability by either excluding or suppressing either Sunni or Shia. It won't work over the long term, and such an approach is inconsistent with our values. Interestingly, Iraq is trying to break the mold in this part of the region, trying to establish a government where Sunni, Shia, and Kurds and other minority groups are working together for a common future. There have been setbacks. It has not gone the way we had hoped. The Maliki government has been insufficiently inclusive with respect to its Sunni minority. Interestingly enough, the resurgence of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which on the one hand is so threatening, is also an opportunity, because the Maliki government has recognized that to deal with the al-Qaeda problem, it will need the Sunni tribes. And the Sunni tribes have understood that they are in a position now to demand greater inclusiveness from the central government as the price of their participation. So we may, out of this dark page, actually have an opportunity to relaunch the inclusive experiment in Iraq. Which brings us to the fourth struggle, Democrats versus authoritarians. Here the jury's out. There have been big setbacks. I think the region is learning, and there's some glimmers of hope. And this is the most important struggle, I would argue, because it is the key for resolving the other three. Someone who's known, I think, to many of you, a man named Marwan Muasher, who is the former foreign minister of Jordan. He and I were on a panel a year or two ago, and he said something I thought very interesting. He said the problem in the Arab Middle East is that there are two political traditions in the Arab world. Arab nationalism, often embodied in military rule, and political Islam, of which an example more recently has been the Muslim Brotherhood. Marwan makes the point that neither of these traditions embodies a tradition of tolerance and inclusiveness. And I would argue neither model has provided long-term stability or prosperity to the people of the region. Indeed, some states have oscillated between the two models, as Algeria did in the 1990s and as Egypt did today. If you think about it, 2011 in Egypt was a revolution in the name of freedom, democracy, and economic prosperity. And that gave way to an authoritarian exclusiveness imposed by a Muslim Brotherhood government. That caused a rebellion among the Egyptian people, but now we have an authoritarian exclusiveness imposed by the military. The result? Increasing dissent, demonstrations, and now terrorist violence. I would argue that the military regime will also fail to deliver prosperity or stability if it does not change direction in the direction of more inclusiveness and tolerance. It's ironic that some of the monarchies in the region are making the most progress in this regard. Slow, UAE, Morocco, Jordan. But for post-revolutionary societies, I think, oddly enough, they need to look to Tunisia. And it's fascinating what's going on there. They began a national dialogue that included all elements of society. A Muslim Brotherhood-led government then stepped aside in favor of a more inclusive technocratic alternative. A constitution has recently been adopted that is startlingly inclusive for this region, and they are proceeding in an orderly way towards elections. This model of tolerance and inclusiveness, the prerequisites of democratic governance, is the model to which the region ought to look. For it offers the path of resolving on a non-zero-sum fashion the struggles between Sunni and Shia, between secularists and theocrats, and moderates versus extremists. It also offers the promise of political participation, self-respect, and economic improvement to those frustrated young people who otherwise might be tempted to find meaning in the life of the Islamist terror. And finally, it can lead to legitimate governments with public support that they will need in order to fight the residual terrorist threat that will be with us in the region for some time. And that's why I say of these four struggles, it is this fourth, the Democrats versus the authoritarians, that we really need to win. Thank you very much, and now look forward to a conversation on that.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. When I was recruited by the organizers of the conference at INSS to have this conversation with you, they said to me, "Be nice to him," which seemed like an eminently reasonable request, especially since I've discovered that you're a nice guy. Notwithstanding the fact that you're trained as a lawyer. But we had a preliminary discussion yesterday, and you said, look, you don't have to be that nice. You can ask some provocative questions or challenge or even disagree with some of the things that I may have mentioned in opening remarks. So I'd like to take you up on that, if I may, and pose a couple of questions to you in that vein. The first one is the following. You've given a kind of a preliminary or interim assessment of the way things have developed in the region over the last couple of years, and I'm sure you'd agree that it's still early days when one thinks of historical developments over time. There's even a story about one of your former bosses, I don't know if it's true, Henry Kissinger, who went to break the ice in China and made small talk with Zhou Enlai, decided he'd start out with some kind of neutral ground, and he asked him, what do you think about the consequences of the French Revolution? The story is, Zhou Enlai's answer was, well, it's too soon to tell. And I think probably most people would agree it's certainly too soon to tell how things are working out in terms of the upheavals in this part of the world over the last couple of years. Nevertheless, I think the preliminary assessment you gave is one that most people would probably agree with, which is that things have not really worked out that well so far. And my question to you, therefore, is this. If that is the case, does it cause you or some of your colleagues to have any second thoughts after the fact about the freedom agenda of the president you served?
I guess I would say that the developments in some sense have vindicated the importance of that agenda. And I think what I tried to suggest in my remarks is if these four struggles are going to be resolved in a positive way, it is only going to be if these countries can find their way towards a more tolerant and inclusive path. I think that's the only way it gets done, in a way that brings a stable and prosperous future. And, you know, I think one of the things you need to point out is, you know, some people think that the freedom agenda was somehow the exclusive of George W. Bush. And, of course, promoting freedom is at the core of what the United States has stood for over 2 centuries. It is in our Constitution. Freedom, democracy, equality, liberty. And every war we've ever fought has been in the name of fighting tyranny and giving people a chance to be free. So this has been part of America from the beginning. And the Bush administration carried this on, but we had an opportunity to focus on it, particularly because of the al-Qaeda threat and because of 9/11, where we saw that there were really 2 ways that we had to fight that threat. One is to go after the terrorists before they could attack us again. But secondly, we had to have an alternative to the terrorist narrative, one that provided hope. One provided hope for people that they could actually find a path to taking control of their own lives and build their own future. And that was, again, freedom, democracy, tolerance, and inclusion. And so the president gave increased prominence to what has been a theme of American foreign policy for 200 years because of the particular requirements in 9/11. And he also said at the time that the authoritarianism of the Middle East would not last, would not provide stability, and at some point it would fade away. And that process, of course, began in 2011.
Well, I think some people might argue actually that the process began in 2003, but we can get back to that in a minute. I think you were here this morning when you heard the defense minister speak, and he expressed a view which is fairly widespread, I think, not just in Israel, but in many other parts of the Middle East, which is that this kind of agenda is well-meaning, even morally uplifting and inspiring, but it's premised on certain kinds of assumptions about the universality of values, which may be a little bit naive, which may not actually reflect the cultural uniqueness of different parts of the world, including the cultural uniqueness of this part of the world. And therefore, the expectation that if only given a chance, people everywhere will opt or prefer the same kinds of socio-political outcomes, it may be a completely misplaced assumption.
Well, it's a little inconsistent, though, with history. If you look at the number of states, Freedom House does an index of free societies, and if you look at the number of free societies going back 50 years ago versus today, it's been a dramatic increase. Historically, where people have had an opportunity to vote with their feet, freedom versus staying under tyranny, they've always voted for freedom. We used to say that about Asia. Asia was a culture that was not congenial to democratic values. And then we saw Taiwan and Japan and South Korea. And in some sense, if you look at historically, freedom has been on the march with considerable setbacks from time to time. The empire does strike back, we say, in terms of the authoritarians. But freedom has really been on the march in every region of the world, except the Middle East. The Middle East was the great exception. And people said, you know, maybe this is a culture where people do not have the capacity to be free. And the president that Elliot Abrams and I served rejected that and said, this is a place that is destined to be free, and we should encourage it to be so. But it will do so at its own time and its own way. And that process, I think, has begun. Now, it's one thing to say freer societies based on tolerance and inclusion and respect for rule of law and individual rights. Those are basic principles. How they get translated into a political order or a social order is going to depend. Well, it's going to depend on the history,
that's
the
really
culture,
what
all the rest.
I wanted to push you on. Okay?
And that's exactly right. But I think what we've seen historically is if the choice is between tyranny and freedom, people pick freedom. And
Steve, I think you have correctly pointed to pluralism grounded in tolerance as the key to the evolution of societies towards the kind of socio-political structures that I guess most of us are looking for or hoping for. How do you operationalize that? I mean, I don't think anyone would agree that the power of outside actors to influence these processes is far from unlimited. It is limited. But even within that limited confine of ability to influence, how do you push a value like tolerance?
One, you can try to argue to people that it is a key to reconcile, to providing a framework in which differences can be reconciled. But one of the things the defense minister pointed on today was the great empowerment of individuals and people because of communication, social media, and all the rest. So if you give it half a chance, people will demand tolerance and inclusion from the bottom up. And in some sense, I think Egypt was a very interesting example. They've, I think, tragically fallen off the track a bit. But really, that was the complaint that they had, the Egyptian people had against the Muslim Brotherhood government. They opted for the Muslim Brotherhood government after the fall of Mubarak because those were the forces that were organized, that had been champions in some sense of resisting the Mubarak government. And the Muslim Brotherhood got in power, and rather than running a tolerant, inclusive society, they excluded people. And the Egyptian people said that was not what we bargained for. And they rose up and they threw it out. Now, one of the problems there is the burdens of change can become so onerous and the economic consequences of turmoil so great that they become, in some sense, the enemies of the progress to a more tolerant and democratic outcome. And they have taken, excuse me, a detour with military authoritarianism. I don't think that's going to work in the long term, and I think at some point the Egyptian people are going to figure that out.
Well, I'm sure all of us hope that you're right, but it's possible that the experience of history is not encouraging. I mean, Egypt went through that kind of trial and error process 100 years ago. There was a stronger liberal democratic movement in Egypt in the 1920s and 30s than there is now, and it failed. It was pushed back by the kind of forces that you said Marwan Mouasher pointed to, and it's still, I think all of us would still be grateful if you or somebody else could provide a persuasive explanation of why that happened and why it won't happen again.
It may. building societies, democratic societies, is hard work. It is not straight line, and there is a falling back. And I would say it's really three things. It is inclusion, tolerance, and rule of law, which is in some senses one of the real problems for societies making this transition, because without it, you get senses of entitlement, you get corruption, and all the rest. These are, in the end of the day, for enduring democracies, you have to have institutions. It's not just about elections. Elections can be a terrific catalyst for change. But in the end of the day, it is about building the institutions that ensure respect for human rights, rule of law, inclusiveness. And that takes a long time. We've been at it in my own country a couple hundred years. It is, we were all encouraged by what happened in 2005 when there seemed to be so much movement towards democracy and freedom. And then in sort of 2006, as we say, the authoritarian empires struck back, and we saw just how difficult this process is going to be. So there are going to be ups and downs, the good days, bad days, some progress and setbacks. It is a long process. And what I think from a policy standpoint we need to do, both the United States and Israel, we need to be clear on our principles, on where we think these states' real stability and prosperity lies. And the thing I think my own country in some sense got lost on in dealing with Egypt, which was admittedly an extremely difficult position, but we in some sense got forced into a position where it looked like we were picking winners. We were for Mubarak until we were against Mubarak. And then it seemed to be we were for the Muslim Brotherhood until they were overthrown. And now there's some pressure for us to side with the military. Well, that course, not by design, has resulted in us alienating just about everybody on the Egyptian political scene. Whereas if we had said, look, we think what the 2011 in Tahrir Square was about was a people wanting to be free, establish a tolerant, inclusive society based on the rule of law, and we're with the Egyptian people on that. And if you elect a government, in this case the Muslim Brotherhood government, and they pursue that agenda of inclusion, tolerance, freedom, and the rule of law, they have our support. But when they move from that path, they don't. And we should have the same rule with the Egyptian military. I think if we had done that from the beginning, it would have been a more resilient policy, it would have helped the Egyptian people, and it would have avoided a situation where we are marginalized and have very little influence. So I think the ticket is, this is the work of generations. We ought to be clear on the direction, clear on the elements of a productive, stable society, and that's what we should stand for, and that's what we should help countries achieve.
All right, let me take you off on a different tack for a minute, if I might. You're in a hall full of people who give advice. You're actually in a country full of people who give advice, even when it's not asked for, maybe especially when it's not asked for. But very few of us have been in a position you have been in of providing national security advice to a head of government. So if I might, I'd like to shamelessly exploit your presence here and ask for some hypothetical thoughts from you. Not about the current American administration, because I know you won't do that, but about the current Israeli administration.
You think I won't comment on mine and I will comment on yours?
I'm not finished yet. A few of us last night had the opportunity to hear Sir John Scarlett say that despite his vast experience, he consistently refuses to preach to others what he thinks they ought to do. But you're not going to get off the hook so easily. So please preach to us. If you were the national security advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel, what 3 pieces of advice would you give him?
Well, I don't think he needs any advice from me. And I thought actually, I thought Rob Satloff did a terrific job of saying something I think that needed to be said. I was asked a question by the Israeli media, well, what do you think about Kerry's pressuring Prime Minister Netanyahu? And I said, I thought that was a bad rap. I thought that this is in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, this is negotiations that the parties have decided they want to enter into. Once you enter into the negotiations, it begins to create its own pressure. And as Rob said, he thinks Prime Minister Netanyahu entered into those negotiations for good reasons in terms of Israeli interests. And I guess that's something a national security advisor would give advice to any president or prime minister. Do things because you think it serves the interests and values of your country. And if you use that as your touchstone, you'll serve your country well.
Well, on behalf of INSS, I'm sure we all wholeheartedly agree with you. And we want to thank you for sharing your time with us. And we look forward to continuing our relationship with you. Stephen Hadley.
Thank you.